I'm going to keep this relatively brief. And really today, I'm going to be sharing a portion of a longer talk, which in turn is a portion of a broader research project that I've been working on since I left Twitter. But as Randy said, to give you a bit of background, these days I'm an academic. Before Twitter, I was an academic. I got my PhD in communication from UPenn, studying trust and safety before that was really the name that we had given this field of practice. And so I've been working on online safety and security issues for about 15 years in an academic context, then in the private sector, and now from a research standpoint again. And especially since leaving Twitter, I've been interested in really trying to parse out what the factors are that are influencing the governance decisions that platforms make. We tend to think that platforms are these sort of unencumbered forces that make decisions at will, capriciously, and we're just sort of hapless victims of their actions. And to some extent, that's true. But I also think there are broader strategic dynamics at play that are influencing the choices that platforms make, and how platform governance works in the real world. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a framework for understanding these dynamics that I've been developing since leaving Twitter, and then would love to talk more about it in the Q&A portion and discussion. So let's start with regulation. When we think about the decisions that platforms make, a lot of our concepts for how this works begins with a notion of some top-down regulatory approach that informs how platforms operate. And we can look to any of the notable examples from the last decade or so of platform governance, from GDPR to Singapore's so-called fake news law, POFMA, to the Online Safety Act in Australia, and now also by the same name in the UK, received royal assent just a couple weeks ago, to NetzDG, to the Digital Services Act. There's a panoply of regulation that is built to inform and influence the decisions that tech platforms make. And usually when we're thinking about why platforms act in certain ways, it comes back to the law. Elon Musk has famously said that his approach to governing Twitter is we will follow the law in the countries in which we operate. And so I think that's a reasonable starting point, but I would say that it's necessary but not sufficient for understanding how platform governance actually works. And so I'm going to offer two other dynamics that I think influence these processes in really important ways. The first one is what I would call regulation by hostage taking. And so let's look at a couple of examples of how this works. In 2008, an Italian court decided to try to prosecute Google for a failure of content moderation. A video had been uploaded to YouTube that showed some young children bullying one of their classmates. Their classmate was disabled, and they were bullying this child on the basis of their disability. And when the video was reported to YouTube, YouTube did the right thing. They took the video down consistent with their terms of service. But Italian officials found that YouTube should have done it faster. How fast is fast enough? Who knows? They kind of were just making it up as they went. And so an Italian judge ultimately found that 3 of Google's global executives were convicted of violating Italian law over the availability of this video for a relatively short period of time. And what was interesting about this decision was that it wasn't that these executives themselves had any particular role in making this decision. They weren't based in Italy. They weren't even content moderators or anything like that. They just were people that seemed to be public representatives of Google, and Italian courts convicted them of failing to take down this content appropriately. And it meant that, if one of these executives went on vacation to Rome with their family, they ran the risk of being arrested as soon as they entered the country. And this marked a really interesting and substantive shift in the relationship between platforms and governments. This wasn't a case of financial penalties. This wasn't a case of corporate liability. It pinned responsibility for a corporate decision squarely on 3 executives who actually had nothing at all to do with the decision. And the court was very intentional in doing this as a way to try to create real consequences for Google. And we've seen this dynamic play out in a number of other countries since then. one of the most famous cases was in Brazil in 2016, when Brazilian authorities, in connection with a drug trafficking investigation, tried to demand data from WhatsApp that WhatsApp literally didn't have. End-to-end encryption was in place at the time, and authorities were demanding information that even if Facebook had wanted to turn it over, they simply couldn't have. And so this led to a multi-year standoff between Facebook and the Brazilian government, in which they tried fining them, and Facebook paid the fines and moved on because it was a rounding error. And then they tried blocking access to WhatsApp in all of Brazil, which went over pretty badly because something like 100 million people in Brazil used WhatsApp. And so turning off WhatsApp was a bad idea. And so then they did the next most obvious thing, which was arrest the Facebook market director for Latin America, who, again, had no ability to give them the data that they were looking for. This person wasn't even responsible for law enforcement data production. And by the way, it's encrypted anyway. But they arrested the guy and put him in what they called preventive prison. It's not clear what they were trying to prevent, but in any event, a day later, a higher court overturned this and ordered them to release this executive. But it set a kind of chilling precedent in Silicon Valley, where all of a sudden local employees of multinational firms could be the targets of these types of enforcement actions for decisions that they had nothing to do with. It was an even more severe version of what played out in Italy in 2008. And the dynamics have only gotten worse and more intense since then. We've seen similar examples come up in India, where my team applied a content moderation label to some misleading posts from an Indian politician. And in response, counterterrorism police raided Twitter's offices in the country. And of course, we can't talk about government repression without talking about Russia. Ahead of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin sent agents of a state security service to the home of a Google executive to demand the removal of apps that were used to protest against Putin and against the Russian government, saying that if Google did not remove the apps from the Google Play Store within 24 hours, the executive would be imprisoned. And I hear jail in Russia is not a super fun thing. And so Google did the only thing they could do, which was comply with the order. And Apple did exactly the same thing. And so these types of hostage-taking dynamics are increasingly where the rubber meets the road of regulation. It's no longer, GDPR was groundbreaking in many ways for contemplating enormous fines on platforms for failures of privacy. And here we're seeing an escalation even further to say, look, it's not just about money impacting a corporate bottom line. We literally will put your executives in jail. And that pretty significantly alters what these dynamics look like. And so there are laws already on the books that contemplate these types of penalties in India, Russia, Turkey, Nigeria, Germany, Vietnam, and they're under consideration in a bunch of other countries as well, including in the UK, where elements of this were being heavily debated as part of the Online Safety Act. And so I would just note that this dynamic of shifting responsibility onto individual employees of companies is increasingly structuring what platform regulation looks like. But things have gotten even more complicated since then. And I would offer the phrase stochastic regulation as a way to describe the emerging dynamics of not just going after companies, not just going after individual executives, but having these processes of sudden, abrupt, extreme personal victimization as a way to try to influence certainly how companies are operating, but I think there's impacts on broader fields of research and tech governance as well. So I'll start with an example from Twitter from 2018. I'm sure many of you have heard of Project Veritas. The organization recently disbanded after it turns out their founder was embezzling money. But back in 2018, they were the hotness on the block, and they decided to advance the narrative that Twitter is biased against conservatives, something I'm sure many of you have heard many, many times. It turns out there's no evidence to support it, but Project Veritas came to Twitter's holiday party one year and found some drunk Twitter employees who were hanging out at the holiday party. I was there. It was an awkward affair. And in a way that is illegal in the state of California. They recorded people without their permission and then posted those videos online in a way that was edited to make it seem like Twitter employees were admitting to censoring conservatives. And of course, the employees said nothing of the sort, but this led to a wave of outrage that defined the next 5 years, and in a way still does define how we think about the regulation and governance of platforms. You saw here that it wasn't companies, it wasn't corporate decisions, it wasn't even executives, it was rank and file employees who were being targeted by some of these campaigns and were being allegedly exposed for their role in some type of perceived wrongdoing. And I've unfortunately been a bit at the center of this. In 2020, after Twitter fact-checked one of Donald Trump's posts for the first time, I was personally targeted by a campaign that started on Fox News, extended to the cover of the New York Post, and then ultimately resulted in a tweet from the former president himself calling me a hater. And so I sort of had to ask the question, like, what's the strategy here? Is this just about going after me personally, or is there something bigger here? And the conclusion that I had to come to after seeing how Twitter responded to this incident, after observing the ways that other companies have responded to it, is that this isn't accidental. This isn't just the personal victimization of individual employees. It is a strategy of working the ref. It's an attempt to try to influence the decisions that platforms make, not by passing laws, but by making it so that they pause and think twice before taking some type of controversial action. Ref working isn't new. If we think now about platforms being biased against conservatives, if you go back to the 90s, you see similar narratives about the mainstream media having a liberal bias and being biased against conservatives. And there's lots of flavors of this argument that play out in different contexts. This isn't just about American conservatives and liberals, but ultimately it's a theory of governance that is built not on a rule of law, not on a system of justice, not even on laws existing at all, but on these processes of social influence on key individuals. And the scary thing is it works. We've seen that as these campaigns have played out targeting platform employees as well as researchers, that there's been a marked shift in how Silicon Valley is approaching trust and safety questions. We've seen that as social media companies have faced heat from the House of Representatives, they've dismantled many of the teams that were responsible for election security. And this isn't just Twitter. We've seen Facebook do it. We've seen Google do it. We've seen the government itself pull back on its engagements with platforms, not because a court told them to, but just because they're scared. They're worried about what might happen, what hearing could take place. And so the FBI is meeting with platforms less often. The security is walking away from some of its work around disinformation. And we've seen that the companies themselves pull back, and also that the research community pulls back. This is an excerpt from an interview that the former head of the Stanford Internet Observatory, Alex Stamos, did with the House Judiciary Committee, in which he said that the sheer financial cost of having legal defenses for academic researchers dealing with congressional inquiries and lawsuits is now making even an institution as well-funded as Stanford hesitate before they continue to support this type of work. Not a single law has been passed. Not a single court case has decided that there was a violation of the First Amendment here or that anybody did anything wrong. And yet we are already seeing people pull back. And so I think there's a cycle here, and it's something that we can see play out again and again, and that, in my view, is going to continue to influence what tech regulation looks like going forward. The stochastic cycle begins with personal allegations like the ones that targeted me or that have targeted folks like Kate Starbird and Renee DiResta. This leads to outrage and attacks. Certainly, there are disastrous personal consequences when you are targeted by these campaigns. But then the real business happens. This is an agenda-setting exercise. The outrage leads to the definition and consolidation of a public narrative. You hear it on cable news, you hear it in the halls of Congress, and at a certain point, the repetition of this outrage narrative takes the place of factual discussion. We normalize the conclusions of the outrage cycle. And in turn, that creates a set of chilling effects around doing this work going forward. It chills platforms doing content moderation work. It chills researchers studying some of these areas. And ultimately, it doesn't even matter if the laws hold up in court or if the Judiciary Committee finds that there was some type of wrongdoing. The damage to research and to the ability of people to do this work has largely already been done. And then you move the goalposts to some other issue and the cycle starts all over again and it keeps playing out. What I really worry about is that few institutions at this stage have the ability to resist these processes. We don't have good mechanisms for dealing with stochastic regulation. And we also don't really, if we're interested in what actual meaningful regulatory intervention could be, we don't have a way of integrating these stochastic processes into what formal regulation and governance looks like. So not really ending on a particularly upbeat note, except to say, I think the first step to dismantling some of these damaging processes is naming them and understanding them. And that's hopefully what I'm at least making a little bit of an intervention in with some of this work. So let me stop sharing my screen and then happy to get into Q&A.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Yoel. It was really wonderful to hear, and so insightful to hear all of the research and governance work that you've been doing. So I guess my first question that I would ask you is, what are some practical ways research can be used to combat mis and disinformation online?
Yeah, I mean, the first is just make sure that there is a robust foundation of fact available to inform these discussions. And, there's the joke sometimes, like, you don't bring facts to a meme fight, and we can get into that, but like, we do still need facts, right? It matters that there is peer-reviewed research that establishes that platforms are not biased against conservatives. It might not persuade Jim Jordan, it might not persuade Project Veritas, but it matters that that research exists, because ultimately, regulation is not just going to happen in the United States, it's going to happen around the world. And the availability of research here is substantive and significant. And so I would say first, like, facts do matter. We should think about how to communicate them in a way that doesn't cede the narrative ground to bad faith actors, but just establishing a ground truth is a significant factor here. But beyond that, I think there's also the possibility for research to inform the direction that new and emerging platforms are going in. We are, for the first time in a long time, in a space where some of the incumbents in the social media landscape are not clearly going to be the dominant platforms 5 or 10 years from now. We're seeing that as Twitter has declined, there's alternatives to it. Some of them might be built by Meta, which in my view is not ideal, but we're seeing Mastodon, we're seeing Blue Sky, we're seeing innovation in the social media space. Those platforms are looking for research to inform the products that they build, to try to avoid some of the harmful dynamics that have played out on social media over the last 10, 15 years. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for researchers to inform that type of work directly.
Yes, absolutely. And what type of laws do you think need to be considered by lawmakers and regulators to mitigate the spread of mis and disinformation more broadly?
This is a really tricky one, because I'm actually not, I'm personally not a fan of governments defining what misinformation and disinformation actually are. I think we've seen the ways that some of those terms are wielded to justify promoting and entrenching the interests of people who already have political power. We've seen that in India, for example, the ruling party has not hesitated to dismiss criticism and dissident speech as disinformation and to demand that platforms remove it. And so I think that's a kind of dangerous line to cross. Even in Europe, we've seen that, Thierry Breton has talked about, in the context of civil unrest in France, that that platforms have a responsibility to shut down that type of dissent because it's undermining public order. And I look at that and I think, that's scary. Like, it's scary if politicians can demand the restriction of speech that criticizes government. But I do think there's space for laws. And the biggest opportunity here is about transparency and data access. I think Article 40 of the DSA, which is focused on providing researchers with access to data, is incredibly important. I think it's, still a little bit TBD exactly how it will play out, but scrutiny of these issues should be happening outside of government. Translational work to help the public understand these dynamics has to happen outside of government. And I think it begins with data access and transparency. And so broadly, I'm bullish on those types of initiatives. I think there's better and worse forms of transparency, but regulation that provides people with insight and access into how companies operate is a good first step.
Yes, absolutely. Totally agree with that. And what do you see as the next few years of trust and safety kind of looking like? What's your vision of trust and safety in the future?
You're catching me on a pessimistic day. So I'll give you kind of the pessimistic take on it, which is, I think it's a pendulum swinging, right? Like I started studying online trust and safety issues in 2010, 2009. I started working at Twitter first in 2014, then in 2015. I left in 2022. I saw a lot of change. And I would say broadly, the pendulum swung while I was at Twitter from a pretty laissez-faire attitude towards speech towards a notion of being much more proactive about harm reduction and mitigation. Twitter certainly wasn't perfect, but it was better. For example, when I started at Twitter, about 0% of the company's content moderation was proactive. All of it was responsive to a specific report from a user. By the time I left, about 60% of the company's content moderation was proactive. That's not good enough, right? There's another 40% there. But there was a shift from people have to report bad stuff before platforms do anything to a notion of platforms will proactively govern themselves. And I think that's a really positive shift. And the drivers of it were activism, public outrage, regulatory scrutiny, and ultimately investment by companies in building out their trust and safety teams. The pendulum is swinging the other way. In large part because of these processes of stochastic regulation, we are seeing American companies decide that it's not worth it to keep investing in trust and safety. They've spent millions of dollars building teams to do this work, and they still get yelled at in Congress. Like there's not an ROI from the perspective of many Silicon Valley firms. And so we're seeing them pull back on their investments in these areas. Now, 5 years from now, I think the pendulum is going to swing right back. And it's going to swing back for exactly the same reasons we saw it swing in the first place. The 2016 election and Russian foreign interference was a major factor in driving public outrage. We saw major privacy scandals like Cambridge Analytica. Bracket, I think that one was a little bit overblown, but it defined the public narrative around these issues in a way that motivated companies to change their behavior. I think we're going to see those same dynamics happen, but it's going to happen because companies screw it up. They get called out for screwing it up, and then they respond to their screw-ups by reinvesting in this space. But how much harm has to happen? How many people have to get hurt or die before companies realize that they actually solved these problems back in 2017, and they're just going to be doing the same thing all over again?
Wow. Yeah. So I kind of want to end a bit on an optimistic note. So what are you optimistic about when it comes to the future of online safety in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I'll go back to something I said earlier, which is I'm excited about competition. I'm excited that for the first time, there are credible alternatives to centralized corporate platforms. And I'm excited about it for a couple of reasons. The first one is like the notion of decentralized and federated social media is interesting, and in my view, creates some opportunities for governance that we haven't seen before. Instagram is a community that has 3 billion people in it. And we've charged Meta, the company, with coming up with a governance approach that works for 3 billion people in hundreds of different countries and thousands of different sociocultural contexts. Like, I actually don't know that that works. Like, if you just think about like Dunbar's number, like I don't know that humans can think about governance at the scale of a 3 billion person community. And so federated social media seems like it offers us a better alternative, which is smaller communities interconnected with each other. I think there's a lot of work to be done to make that a truly viable alternative, but I'm excited about that possibility. I'm excited that we're seeing services build with safety and governance at their core. I'm excited that we're seeing services like Blue Sky build with things like data portability and interoperability at the core of their strategy. And I think all of that is pointing to a future where, we probably will still see Meta be a dominant player, but we'll potentially start to see some new and interesting options for consumers as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, for sharing your insights, Yoel. So we're going to stop the recording